What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and I want to talk to you about the final volume in Chris Claremont's mid-2000s Uncanny X-Men run, the first Foursaken. This collects issue 472 through 474 and annual 1 from the 2000s. And this, unfortunately, is not very good. I want to go ahead and say it's not terrible. It's not the worst thing that Chris Claremont wrote in the 2000s. I think that just about every volume of his mid-2000s Uncanny run is better than almost everything in his Extreme X-Men run, which happened just immediately before this run. So it's really weird to me that he goes from such a subpar, awful series like Extreme X-Men to something that it's not breaking new ground, but it's a lot better than Extreme X-Men was. It's very enjoyable. It feels a lot closer to his old form that he had hit back in the 1980s. I'm not going to say, like I said, he's not really doing anything that's going to blow your mind like the Dark Phoenix Saga or Days of Future Past, but I would say, at least for the first half of this Uncanny run, it was good, solid superhero stories, which was something that Claremont hadn't done in a while. And like I said, this particular volume, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's the end of his run, and it feels like it just kind of fizzles out. It doesn't really end in any satisfying way. It's just kind of like, oh, okay, we need to wrap some things up so that Ed Brubaker can come on board next month. And it doesn't really feel like Claremont knew that he was going to be ending when he was. Maybe he did. Maybe he was pleased with where he ended this run. But this really just kind of felt like he was rushed a little bit. Maybe not even rushed. It just feels like this doesn't actually feel like a finale to any writer's run. It feels like just kind of a story that's there. It's not bad. It's not good. This does wrap up the subplot with Jamie Braddock showing up here and there in the background for the last few volumes. He's kind of been in the background sort of haunting Betsy and even Rachel, kind of showing up and being like, hey, I'm Jamie Braddock, and then you don't really know what he's up to. We finally find out that he is the reason that Betsy is now back from the dead, and he specifically brought her back to be a weapon against something that he calls the first Foursaken. And Betsy says that this was the name of him and his buddies from before he became an unhinged psychopath. Basically, he and three of his pals, they just went around doing stuff, causing mischief. They all became race car drivers, and then three of them allegedly died. And then the Watcher, who shows up to watch whatever, he tells the X-Men there's another meaning behind the first Foursaken. And there's this entity that's like the anti-Phoenix. At two different points in this book, they say that it's like the opposite of the Phoenix. This entity is called the First Fallen. And basically this thing, every cycle, every cosmic cycle, it will gather a servitor. That is what the Watchman says. And the Watchman says there are 7 cosmic cycles in the span of the entire universe. And it goes and it grabs a servitor in each cycle. Now, to me, that means that it goes and grabs one servant every cosmic cycle. And the Watcher says that 4 cosmic cycles have happened so far, so in theory, it should have 4 servants, but the first one should be a whole lot older than the most recent one. But that's not what happens. All of Jamie's buddies from before he went crazy, they're all servants of the First Fallen. And then Jamie, I guess, is the fourth wheel who's not really serving the First Fallen willingly. And basically, this guy wants to take the 4 of his servants and give them their own little paradise world with all these other previous servants that he's gathered from other worlds, and then he wants to destroy Earth permanently. Whereas the Phoenix will destroy and then create. This thing just wants to destroy. But it wants to, kind of like Brainiac from DC Comics, it wants to take a little sample of each civilization that it destroys and keep that sample saved for all time. And then basically, Jamie has molded Psylocke so that she can't be controlled by entities like the First Fallen or Proteus or the Shadow King. She can't be controlled by them, so she's kind of like a wild card who's able to fight back while none of these other people are able to fight back. And they win. It's a pretty easy win. I've seen battles with Magneto, who is a much less powerful villain than this guy, where the stakes felt a lot higher. Like I said, this kind of just feels like a mess story. It's a 3-part story. Basically, it answers the question of how did Psylocke come back from the dead, but it doesn't really feel like this is the end end of the run. It feels like this run very easily could have gone on for another couple volumes. And if you weren't keeping up with X-Men at the time and you just found this somewhere in a bookstore or in a comic book shop where it's sitting on the back of a shelf or something, and you bought this, you probably wouldn't realize that this was the end of Claremont's run. You would be forgiven if you thought that there was another couple of story arcs that he had in him after this. But this goes straight into Rise and Fall of the Shi'ar Empire by Ed Brubaker. And unfortunately, it's just kind of there. I don't have a whole lot of complaints other than it's just there. It doesn't really do anything for me one way or another. It's lukewarm for me. It's not great. It's not really awful. At least if it was awful, I would have some reaction to it. But this just kind of left me sitting there saying, okay, that was the thing. And then there's the annual, which actually is even less necessary than the rest of this book. And I'm not saying that the rest of this book is unnecessary, just that it doesn't feel like a storyline that should be the climax of this entire run. But this annual is basically picking up with a subplot that's kind of been very much in the background for the last couple volumes, where Storm has been in Africa, and there is this evil general guy who's going around terrorizing his villages, because after House of M, none of these villages have mutant protectors anymore. Apparently, before House of M, there were these mutants who would protect all of these villages, and now the mutants are either depowered or they're dead, and then the general guy is going around and he's killing the few mutants that are left, or he's recruiting them. And then Storm is like, okay, we need to stop this guy, and I need the X-Men's help. Now, this is a really weird thing where Storm was featured in Uncanny X-Men, and then out of nowhere, if you're reading these trade paperbacks, suddenly she's not in these books anymore. And then they have like one line that says that she's off on personal time and she's not with the team anymore. And it's really weird. It feels very sudden and comes out of nowhere. That's because her send-off happened in another X-Men comic, Peter Milligan's X-Men run, where she wasn't even a character being featured. But for some reason, Storm's send-off, where she decides to take some time off from the X-Men and go hang out in Africa for a little while, that happens in Peter Milligan's X-Men run, where she's not even a character being used. It felt very weird, and like I said whenever I reviewed that crossover with the Black Panther series, if they're going to, first of all, that storyline was very forced. It felt like they were just doing that storyline to kind of set up the eventual wedding between Black Panther and Storm. If they're going to do a storyline, a crossover between Black Panther and the X-Men, where they're going to eventually set up this wedding between these two characters, they should have at least done it in Uncanny X-Men, so that people who are reading this series will then see, oh, that's why Storm is no longer hanging out with the team. It feels very strange that she's suddenly gone and you barely get any reason why she's gone, and then suddenly she's back again in this annual, and then after they defeat the bad guy, Storm finds out that she has some family that she didn't know about, and then at the end of the book it says, continued in the wedding of Storm and Black Panther. And this is something that I don't feel like Chris Claremont really enjoyed doing this. I know for a fact that he did not like the idea of Storm marrying Black Panther. He said that he felt like that diminished the character of Storm. It made her second banana to Black Panther. And I kind of agree with him. I don't like that Storm kind of became second fiddle to another character in the Marvel Universe who, in my opinion, is less interesting than Storm. Then again, Storm is my favorite X-Man, so I would be biased. But this whole issue is just kind of there. I don't like the wedding between Storm and Black Panther, so this isn't really going to be high on my list of annuals that you should read. But also, I just don't like annuals. I think I've realized that way back when I was reading Claremont stuff from the 80s, where you're reading the issues that are coming out every month, and then suddenly here comes an annual that is either A, going to have absolutely nothing to do with the other 12 issues that came out that year, or B, it's going to have something to do with those issues, in which case, if you don't read the annual, then you're going to feel like you missed something. And that's kind of what's going on here, where there's this subplot that happens in one of the issues in this book, I think 474, and then it happens in one of the issues in the previous volume, where Storm is in Africa, and she's kind of tracking down this evil general guy, and then if you happen to not read that annual, you're going to be very confused what happened to that subplot. And I know that back when I had mail subscriptions for a few different series from Marvel, if there was an annual for the series that you had a subscription for, you did not get the annual in the mail. You had to go and track it down yourself. So I know that was probably a problem for some people, or maybe I overestimate how many people had subscriptions in the mail. I know I had a couple, so I'm sure other people had them back in the day, and maybe they still do now. I don't know. I don't anymore. So those are my thoughts on Claremont's his Uncanny X-Men run. Overall, I think this run was better and more enjoyable than his Extreme X-Men run. I definitely liked the first couple of volumes. I think it started to go downhill after that. I didn't like the volume in the Savage Land as much as the previous 2 volumes, and I thought the House of M book was okay, and I thought this was okay. But overall, I thought these were all much more enjoyable, much better than the Extreme X-Men stuff that he was doing immediately before. Not really anything mind-boggling, nothing that's going to make your jaw hit the floor, but enjoyable superhero stuff. Albeit it is a little bit less enjoyable in the last half than it is in the first half. A little bit more just kind of meh, I guess is the best way to say it. Nothing really bad in this entire run. It feels like I hate it a lot more than I do when I'm trying to explain it, but I feel like Claremont, I don't know if he was just kind of getting sick and tired of editorial mandates kind of horning in on what he had to do. He didn't write House of M, so maybe he didn't enjoy having to do a 4-issue tie-in to House of M. I don't know. And then there was the wedding with Black Panther, and I know he didn't like that. Maybe he didn't enjoy Storm being taken off of his team to set up that wedding. I don't know. But there's several reasons that maybe he wasn't at his 100% A game in the last half of his run, but it is what it is. He wasn't at his 100% A game, whether it was his fault or not. But I do think that if you're wanting to read some solid X-Men stuff, this run, all, I think 5 of these volumes, there's 4 numbered volumes and then the House of M tie-in, they're all pretty solid. There's nothing here that's just really bad. I don't think that you're going to be wasting your money if you went out and bought these books. So that's all I have to say about Claremont's run on Uncanny X-Men from the mid-2000s. Next week I will be covering a newer X-Men book, and then the week after that, I think I'm going to be covering Joss Whedon's Astonishing X-Men. I'll be doing 4 videos on his run there. So look forward to those videos in the next few weeks, and I will see you guys later this week with some other videos. In the meantime, you have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.